faculty who have written the study, and it's due in 4 days, 3 days. So, all right, the floor is yours, Kathleen Kennedy. Can someone online note that that Kathleen can be heard, please?
I can hear you, Andrew. I'm not hearing her.
All right. Thank you, Senator. We're changing computers here.
Okay, can everybody hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. So it's not, you have to go back. Yep, sorry about that. Okay, can you confirm again if you can hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank
Sorry
you.
for the technical difficulties. All right, so for those working group members that were at the preliminary presentation, these results will look very similar. So apologies if there's a repeat, but for those that did not see that initial presentation, we're showing here the results of the study that we've been undertaking. So I'll walk through the results first on small businesses and then discuss energy generating facilities, and we'll end with a little bit of time for discussion or any clarifying questions. So starting with the small businesses piece of the study, we use a definition here of small businesses as having less than 500 employees. And we find that across all of the sectors shown in this graph, small businesses account for about 45% of employment in Maryland and 97% of the firms. Small businesses are particularly prominent in certain sectors. So for instance, in the construction sector, small businesses account for 83% of the sectoral employment. And similarly in professional, scientific, and technical services, small businesses account for 54% of employment. This is compared to some of the other sectors where you may see in the chart, for instance, that the small businesses are much smaller, for instance, here management and companies. We also have a geographical breakdown of where the small businesses are located within the state. So this is in number of small business firms. And we see that overall, the largest number of firms are in this DC to Baltimore corridor of just a few counties in central Maryland. However, when we consider small businesses as a percentage of total employment, we actually see that they're more concentrated in rural areas. For instance, over here in Garrett County, reaching even 80% of employment in the county. So this indicates that small businesses are particularly important for economic activity in those more rural areas of the state. We can further break this down to look even at the zip code level. And here I'm showing the most common small business activities across all zip codes within the state. And we see that the three most common activities are construction, which you see throughout the state in this pink color, professional, scientific, and technical services, which you see in this sort of medium blue color that is again largely located in the DC to Baltimore region. And then finally in retail trade, which is this lighter blue color that you see more in the more rural areas of the state and the Eastern Shore. So when we consider which small businesses in the state are likely to be affected by the energy transition, we break this down into three categories. The first is those businesses that are involved in the direct supply of energy. So this is, for instance, businesses that are generating, selling, or otherwise supplying some form of energy. It could be gasoline, could be electricity, etc. And we provide a case study for each of these different categories. So our case study for the direct supply of energy businesses is RS Automotive. This is a gas station in Tacoma Park, Maryland, that converted their gas station to be fully electric vehicle charging. They also have an auto repair shop that's part of the business as well, so it's a joint effort there. And the way that this transition was able to be successful for them was they've actually partnered with another small business that is fully focused on electric charging, had a deep knowledge of the sector, and was able to help them secure additional funding for the investment needed to do the transition, and then supported them throughout in terms of thinking about how to set it up, how to maintain it over time, and continue to operate it smoothly. So this case study really highlights the importance of using the energy transition as a way for businesses to partner together, share knowledge, and really have mutually beneficial partnerships in this kind of effort. The second category that we identify is businesses involved in the provision of energy services. So this is a somewhat broad category of businesses that provide ancillary services to the energy industry, previously described as the direct supply category. So this could be businesses that manufacture energy equipment or install energy equipment, things like this. Our case study for this category is Elysian Energy. This is a building contractor that works on HVAC systems and other things, and they have actually partnered with Montgomery County on their electrification efforts for the county. So Elysian expressed to us that there was some difficulty involved in their work. They are completely focused on energy efficiency and electrification as a business, that often when they went to potential customers, there was a lot of upfront effort needed to explain the benefits of these investments, having energy efficiency investments, et cetera. And often they had to put in a lot of time and effort to do a good quote and explain all of the different aspects of a given choice without necessarily having any guarantee of income and a sale. And this partnership with Montgomery County has been able to alleviate some of those concerns because the county provides some funding for that upfront investment of time and work. Our last category is energy-intensive businesses. This is where the value production within the business is heavily dependent on energy inputs. And for this case study, we look at Garden and Garnish Catering. They're a small family-owned business out in Trapp, Maryland on the Eastern Shore. And they have adopted solar and put it on the roof of their kitchen, which is actually in the back of their house. And they found that this does substantially lower their energy costs. It's reduced their energy bills by about 30% on average throughout the year. However, there were a lot of barriers associated with this process for them. They had to spend a lot of time researching the potential options for solar installation, thinking about how it would affect their bottom line, what investment was worth it, what incentives were available from state and federal government to help support the transition. And so it was a lot of upfront effort for them to try to navigate this process. Even though it was successful in the end, it was clear that some of these barriers need to be removed to enable businesses to more effectively adopt this kind of option. So when we broaden this out to look at Maryland as a whole, we identify 24% of small businesses as affected by the energy transition in one of these categories. That's roughly 21,551 firms. Specifically in the direct supply category, we identify 1,331 firms that are primarily in retail, trade, and construction. In the energy services category, there's 3,940 firms, and this is primarily in wholesale trade and construction. And the energy intensive firms we identify as 16,280 individual businesses, and this is primarily in accommodation and food services, transportation and warehousing, and retail trade. And I would note here that we use a fairly expansive definition of energy intensive because we wanted to make sure that we were identifying all potential businesses that could be affected rather than leaving some out. So there may be some businesses that fall in our categorization here that would actually feel very few impacts. And when we look in terms of employment, we see that these businesses employ roughly 250,000 Marylanders as of 2021, which is where this is the most recent data available to us. In the direct supply category, we have around 11,580 employees. Energy services employs about 49,137 people, and the energy intensive businesses employ around 191,488 employees. We also wanted to look at the potential economic impacts of the transition on these businesses. And this can be somewhat tricky because you have to think about, each business is a little bit differently situated, and it's difficult to say specifically what the transition will look like for every business. So as at least one example of what an energy transition could look like, we use the Maryland's climate plan that was released last year. And there was analysis done on this plan by the Regional Economic Studies Institute at Towson University. on the economic impacts of that version of a transition for Maryland. And they found that it can provide significant economic benefits between 2024 and 2031, which is the nearest climate goal for the state. It includes a net gain of over 27,000 jobs, a $2.5 billion increase in total personal income, and a $5.3 billion increase in gross domestic product for the state. The highest growth in specific industries was found to be in construction, with an annual average gain of over 2,000 jobs through 2035, and in transportation, which similarly had an annual average gain of over 2,000 jobs. There are also health benefits associated with air quality improvements due to the transition. So this has a secondary economic impact as well through things like fewer work loss days, et cetera. We also did a survey of different policy frameworks that already exist in Maryland to support small businesses through the energy transition. And we identified quite a few that are already in place. Several of these are sort of resource or platform-based programs. So there's the Maryland Entrepreneur Hub, the MEA's Clean Buildings Hub, the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network, and the Maryland Green Registry, which is a registry of businesses throughout the state that have a sustainability focus. There's also a number of loans and grants available from various sources within the state. We break those fully down in the report, but there are quite a lot of them, so I didn't want to walk through every single one here. But we do include both those loans available to households, because there may be many small businesses that are actually run out of the person's house, particularly in early startup phases. There's also loans specifically available to small businesses, and then there are some broadly accessible loans that small businesses may also qualify for. There's also many support mechanisms available at the federal level. So there's loans available from the Department of Energy, the Small Business Administration, and the Small Business Voucher Pilot Program. And finally, there may be distinct programs available at county level as well. We do not do a full survey of this for all the counties in Maryland, but we wanted to raise this as another important area where there could be support for small businesses. From all of this, we arrive at two policy recommendations. So the first is on funding and financing, that we think there's room to further support small businesses in actually accessing all of these funding options that are currently available, making sure that they can utilize existing resources. Financial mechanisms such as green banks can play a critical role here, both as an actual provider of funds, but also as a sort of supporting actor that can help navigate these other difficult processes that may be a little opaque to small businesses that don't have a lot of time to devote to an application. Second is on engagement and technical assistance. So thinking about mechanisms for the state to have sustained engagement with small businesses in the community, making sure that any problems that they encounter through the transition are raised and the government is made aware of these issues. And also thinking about how technical assistance can be provided for things like needs assessment, funding applications, and project implementation. Again, for small businesses that may not have a lot of resources and can really use the help to implement some of the things that they would like to do. These policies should be flexible and inclusive as possible, because as you saw in the previous slides, small businesses affected by the transition will be across a very wide range of sectors. And so targeting very narrowly at one sector may leave out some others. So trying to make this as broad as possible will be an important aspect. Before I go on to energy generating facilities, just wanted to give a chance here. Are there any clarifying questions? Okay, great. So the second section of the report is on energy generating facilities within the state. And we use this framework as kind of a broad way to think about these decisions of what the energy facilities can do to engage with the transition and how they might need to consider potential retirement options. So first, there are the policy priorities that come in from the state, federal levels, and implementation of those policies that will have very clear effects on these facilities. They also work within the context of the PJM grid, which has a mandate for grid reliability and stability. They operate the capacity and wholesale markets, which of course have a market incentive for these businesses. And then at the individual plant level, they are primarily making market-based decisions, what is profitable and economic for them to do, and they will be constrained by what is possible at a given plant based on their specific setup and equipment and all of that. So the sort of broad categories of options that we think about for these facilities in the energy transition is either maintaining their facility as a form of thermal generation, converting to some other type of energy use or storage, and having an other industrial use. So thinking about the policy context for these facilities, the first main policy that will impact them is the Renewable Portfolio Standard in the state. This requires Maryland to source 50% of its electricity consumption from renewable energy by 2030. And there are very specific categories of what's defined as renewable under the RPS. So that includes solar, wind, qualifying biomass, methane from a landfill or wastewater treatment plant, geothermal, ocean-based energy, hydroelectric, poultry litter to energy, waste to energy, and refuse-derived fuel. There's also EPA regulations at the federal level. So these apply to both new and existing fossil fuel power plants. Specifically, there's currently a requirement for coal plants to adopt carbon capture and storage by 2032. And then there are emissions intensity requirements and standards for natural gas and oil steam generating units. There is, of course, a question of if these federal policies will remain in place or change going forward, but these are as they currently exist now. This is also the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI, and this is a multi-state market-based program designed to reduce carbon dioxide emissions from the power sector by 30% below 2020 levels by 2030. And finally, there's the proposed 100% clean energy standard, which Governor Moore has directed the MEA to establish a framework to achieve 100% clean electricity by 2035. But this policy is still under development, so the specifics are not yet known of how that will be defined, what sort of energy sources will be considered, and many of the specifics like this. So we do not do a super specific analysis of this policy, but rather point out throughout the study of where there might be relevant pieces for this 100% clean electricity standard, depending on how it's implemented. So we start with a summary of the existing generation within the state. Here we have it broken out by generation technology. So we have fossil fuel facilities at the top here, nuclear, and then renewables as defined by the RPS at the bottom. And we find there are 33 fossil facilities in the state, which account for about 45.8% of in-state generation in 2023. There are 161 renewable facilities in the state that account for 9.1% of state generation. And this is largely due to the many small solar installations throughout the state, 144 that reach utility scale. We also include the distributed solar generation here as provided in the state energy data system. So further breaking this down, if we look specifically at thermal generating plants, we can see here, these are the generators throughout the state with age of the generator on the x-axis and the capacity factor on the y-axis. So this is, again, data from Maryland in 2023. And we see that nuclear, for instance, has a very specific profile with a very high capacity factor. This means that it is generating most of the time. Capacity factor is the ratio between what the plant could potentially produce over the course of the year versus what it actually produces. The oil facilities we see largely have very low capacity factors and tend to be older units. So there's no new oil facilities for the past 20 years, for instance. And then natural gas facilities span a lot of different capacity factors here, with some operating at very low capacity factors similar to the oil plants actually, and then some operating more like baseload generation up here. We also take a look at these generation types based on employment within the state. So here we're looking at energy employment in Maryland as an industry crosscut. So this is not just employment at a specific facility, but rather employment in the sector as a whole, which could include installation jobs, et cetera. And we see that while fossil fuels account for around 3,700 jobs in the state, renewables actually account for over 9,000 jobs already, even though, as we saw in the previous slides, they represent a smaller fraction of generation. So this is largely due, again, to the solar industry, which has a lot of installation jobs associated with them. So that's largely where these numbers are coming from here. So returning to the thermal generation plants, we can graph here, we've got net generation compared to estimated annual employment. So I want to be very clear, we do not have specific data on employment at each facility. We were not able to find this as a publicly available data set. So instead, what we've done here is estimate employment based on employment factors associated with the type of generation, the base load versus intermediate versus peaker activity at a given plant, and known likely levels of employment at that type of facility. So these should be taken as showing trends, but not exact numbers for these facilities. And we find the facilities that employ more than 50 people are those with very high nameplate capacities. So Calvert Cliffs, of course, being the standout here with the highest both capacity generation capacity and employment. Facilities with medium employment, around 10 to 50 employees, include many of the natural gas and municipal solid waste plants, while facilities with low employment are mainly those with small capacity factors and small nameplate capacities. These are a lot of the oil and landfill gas plants. There are some newer combined cycle natural gas plants that had mid-level employment with a particularly high net generation. And do just want to point out here, the net generation values here are on a logarithmic scale. So this is going up an order of magnitude with each grid line here. So now thinking about the potential for retirement of these facilities. We already know there are 5 confirmed retirements according to information from PJM. So this is in 2024, Warrior Run, which has retired already, and Morgantown, which had 4 generating facilities, 2 of which have been retired now, but 2 are still operating. So not entirely clear when those will eventually come offline, but they are planning to retire. And then in 2025, there is a plan for Herbert Wagner to retire, but that's now caught up in an RMR with Brandon Shores. And there's a plan for Vienna Operations to retire. So the timeline for Wagner and Brandon Shores is still under some discussion with PJM and FERC and all of those entities, but it's expected to be potentially through 2028 based on the need to build out more transmission. So we identify 5 potential paths for facilities navigating the energy transition. The first is reduction in frequency of usage of the plant. So this is perhaps if the 100% requirement were phased in over time, the facility could gradually reduce their use under that timeline. There's the potential for use of alternate fuels such as biomass or hydrogen. Although I would note this does often require some sort of investment in upgrades or retrofits to make this possible. There's also the possibility of retrofitting a facility with carbon capture and storage, though again, this may be more or less suitable for a given plant. There's also the potential to fully retire the facility and then reuse the site for other types of generation. So for instance, putting a renewable facility on that site, or even something like a small modular nuclear as that technology becomes available. And then there's also the possibility of putting energy storage on an existing site, so turning it into, for instance, a battery facility. And finally, there's the potential for retirement without reuse of the site, which could be for those facilities that are already at the end of their economic life and are able to retire without any loss of investment. Any question?
Yeah, sorry. This is Andrew Place. On line 3 there, bullet 3, retrofitting carbon capture and storage. Maybe semantics, but didn't want to give the impression that storage is necessary on site because it could be piped, right?
Right.
So whether, I mean, again, maybe it's understood,
but
Yeah, and we do discuss that in the report that particularly in Maryland, it's rather unlikely that you would actually store on site. So it's more likely you would need to build out some sort of transmission infrastructure for the carbon that's captured. But we do want to emphasize that in order to be considered a low emissions technology, you do need to store the carbon. So we break down the likelihood of these applying to a given facility based on different load profiles. And these will also be heavily dependent on the additional, the way that the 100% clean energy standard is adopted and how that's implemented. So if we assume that that does require fossil fuel plants within the state to stop emitting, then we can think about, for instance, the baseload and intermediate plants that will need to reduce their usage over time as those requirements are phased in, as I mentioned. They could continue operating if they adopt CCS, but this would likely be only for those facilities with high capacity factors because it is a substantial investment. And so if you're only using the facility for a few days or even a week out of the year, as with a peaker, that's probably not going to be economic to do. You can also replace with other electricity generation, such as renewables or an SMR. This is a great way to make use of the existing interconnection that these facilities would have and could potentially speed up the deployment of those technologies because there's no need to build out that transmission for a new site. For low load or peaker plants, there's the possibility of transitioning to alternative fuels to continue using their existing thermal generation equipment. But again, this depends on the type of equipment that they already have. If it's suitable for use for something with biomass or others, it is possible that this would also require some costly upgrades or retrofits. So that will be site dependent of what that possibility looks like for them. There's also the possibility here to replace peaker plants with batteries, which can provide some of the similar grid benefits. However, batteries are most economic when they're run frequently. And so they're not an exact match to peakers, which run very infrequently throughout the year. And so batteries will actually become more economic as there is higher penetration of renewables into the grid, and there's need for more frequent cycling of the batteries. And finally, these may be plants that are eligible for retirement without reuse because they are often much older, have reached their end of their economic life, and so could just retire without reuse if other provision is made for reliability of the grid at that location.
If I may, just so I'm understanding your point about the low load peakers and replacement batteries, and you said there was a caveat on that.
Right.
But it's interconnected, so there's an opportunity to use that site, that acreage, that for batteries that would arbitrage when.
Yeah, absolutely. Just if you only ran those batteries the same amount of time you're running the peaker plant, they're probably not going to be economic.
Right.
So just saying, like, you would want to be able to run them more frequently. That's all. So when we think about the potential impacts of facility closures, oh yeah, question.
Yeah, thank you. The battery as a peaker, is anybody doing that right now as a replacement for peaker, given how long the storage capacity is and what the needs of a peaker are? And how would that even work?
Well, like I said, it's not a one-to-one match. So it's not exactly the same type of operation, partly because you're likely moving toward a more renewable grid while all these other transitions are happening. So a renewable grid will operate somewhat differently than the existing fossil-based grid, right? So you can look at California as one example where they have installed a lot of battery capacity, but they also have a lot of renewable capacity. So those batteries have been very effective at kind of filling in gaps. So they in part act a bit like a peaker, but they also do other things as well.
Okay, so they're really not peakers is really what it comes down to. I mean, it's
right.
it's
Yeah.
useful.
So I want to be clear here. I'm not saying that batteries would be peaker plants. I'm saying they're a potential replacement and a use of the site.
Okay, thank you.
Ryan?
Yeah, I would just add some other clarifying points that expand on what you're saying is that you have those interconnections at that site, which at this point are really valuable.
Yep, exactly.
Because it's really hard to get connections to the grid. And yeah, exactly as you're saying, they're not a one-to-one match for a peaker. Especially as you have more renewables, they can kind of help to fill in that gap where you need more electricity in the short term. So they can help there. But yeah, that's, I think, a use that should really be looked into. So those sites can continue to be used.
Yeah, one very common thread throughout this process has been the value of the interconnection. Over and over, we've heard, the main value of these sites is the interconnection, and being able to reuse that is a really valuable asset. So when we think about the potential impacts of closures at these facilities, there are a few different ways that this could be seen. So first is obviously the direct loss of jobs at the facility. This could be addressed through retraining or relocation of the employees. However, we note that often employees don't really want to relocate because they may have strong ties to the community. So this needs to be considered as well. So really thinking about locally targeted interventions will be important in addressing these kind of job losses. There's also the potential for loss of state and local tax revenues, which could be addressed by investing in new local industries. Again, a locally targeted intervention will be necessary there to replace the revenue for that locality. However, there's also benefits in terms of the improvements in air quality that come from closing down a fossil-fueled facility. So there's better health and environmental outcomes, which could be of significant value as well. We also do a number of case studies for the energy generating facilities. So first, looking at the Warrior Run facility, which, as I mentioned, has already retired. We spoke with the AES Corporation that owns the facility, and they have actually considered all of the different options. They have considered all of the different options that I've laid out here for that facility, thinking about siting battery storage there or some other type of generation, thinking about it becoming a different type of industrial use. These are all things that they have talked about. And they do note that part of that interconnection point as a valuable asset means that other manufacturing facilities might be interested in using that site as well. In particular, data centers are interested in these sites because they have a very high need for electricity, and having that large interconnection already in place can be very valuable for them. However, we do note that this could be a potential problem for reliability if you're taking a generation point offline and then putting a very large load in at the same place. We also consider the Brandon Shores and Herbert Wagner RMR case. So this is really demonstrating that these facility retirement decisions need to reconcile a lot of different things with the technical considerations like maintaining the grid reliability, but also the financial and environmental impacts. And without sufficient preparation, these reliability requirements may slow down attainment of the state emission reduction goals. So really important to be in conversation with the PJM level and coordinating there and thinking about long-term what this process needs to look like. There's also the potential for stranded assets as part of the transition. So this could be an example with Wildcat Point. This is a fairly new natural gas facility in the state. And because they have made a significant investment in bringing that plant online, if they had to close earlier than expected, they could experience a loss based on that investment. So this is, again, an important point when thinking about the options for that facility. They could consider adopting CCS to try to stay online. However, when we spoke with them, they did not really think that was a viable option, that the technology was not ready, and that it would not be economic for them at this time. So it'll be important to have transition plans in place for facilities like this, and the state can consider how to support and transition those particular plants that may be newer and have larger groups of employees that depend on them. And finally, we spoke with folks at the Wheelbrader, the waste incineration facility. This one really highlights all of the different aspects that come into play in these different retirement decisions. These are always complex, but particularly in a case like this, which has implications for so many different policy priorities in the state. So waste incineration does affect GHG emissions, employment, waste diversion efforts, and environmental justice and human health impacts based on the co-pollutant emissions at the facility as well. And it will be essential for state policymakers to decide how to prioritize and balance these different decision points going forward. So we end this part of the report with laying out some of these different considerations, thinking about both the sort of technical and social aspects that may come into play for a given facility, and offering this as a framework for policymakers to think about how to balance something like the number of jobs at the facility and the potential for unemployment in a specific context. So thinking about, is that community already disadvantaged? Is it already a place of high unemployment? All of these different concerns. And from this, we offer 4 policy recommendations for the state. So first, in order to achieve Maryland's climate goals, we note that Maryland will need to rapidly reduce emissions from both imported electricity and in-state generation, both of which are counted in the state's inventory. And so depending again on how this potential 100% clean energy standard is implemented, this will have implications for both of these categories, the in-state and imported electricity. And if this is implemented based on something like the RPS REC system, we may see actually that fossil fuel plants continue to operate in the state for quite some time, and they could simply sell their electricity across state borders. We also emphasize the need for Maryland to support businesses, communities, and local governments in accessing the federal funding opportunities under the IRA. So there's a lot of programs and tax credits, technical assistance, et cetera, available. And this can be a great way to help both with reuse of the facility, thinking about potential new technologies that could be deployed there, and also ways to prioritize communities and get support for them as well. And we also note the need for a robust framework around these kind of facility closure decisions that does encompass all of these different aspects that I've just talked about. So considering the financial and reliability concerns, as well as the social, economic, and environmental impacts. And as part of this, it's essential to have a stakeholder engagement process that is very robust and really tailors these decisions to include the concerns of a given community that's involved in this facility decision. With that, happy to stop and take any more questions. Yes.
Thank you for that rerun of this really important presentation. Thank you. The financial implication in the larger report, does that speak to the implications for the businesses, for the closure, and to the ratepayers as well?
So we don't do a direct analysis of the ratepayer impacts here, but yes, all of those things are aspects that we would consider, an essential part of the decision-making process for sure.
Okay, I can understand if you didn't have the bandwidth to deal with that, but is it in there that obviously is one of those financial considerations?
I'm not sure if we specifically call that out or not, but I can make sure that we do. Yeah.
I just think it's important. I mean, it's a big part that we sometimes miss. You talk about environmental justice and stuff like that, but if you don't talk about ratepayer impact, I mean, it's all part of it.
Absolutely. Yes, we can make sure that's highlighted as well.
Thank you.
This is Andrew Place, if I may. So if I'm paraphrasing you accurately on the Warrior Run comment about CCS, they said that it's not economically feasible.
That was Wildcat.
Wildcat.
That, yeah, they said it was not, in their view, the technology was not yet ready and it was not economically feasible for them to adopt.
And maybe that's the point of the case study, is to get their opinion on that. But
Yeah.
Are we missing an opportunity then to say, what is the delta?
Mhm.
What subsidy price would be required, however you do that, a cost of carbon or whatever else, to hit that break-even point, to then make it justifiable to bolt on CCS. And then sort of knock on to that is, well, if Warrior Run told you to pound salt, Wildcat told you to pound salt, would it be of value to see if there's a DOE analysis out there of a similarly situated 30-year-old coal plants, et cetera, what the technology cost curve is in 2025 or 2030 or 2035. Some that analysis is to be done, or whether there's actually a similarly situated facility somewhere on the planet that have done just that, and we could look at their economics and say, okay, yeah, this is the cost of doing it, and this was the subsidy, the ratepayer subsidy or taxpayer subsidy necessary to do that.
Yeah, so we did look into all of those things, and I would note first with the Wildcat point, they not only said that they don't think it will be viable for them, that the cost of just doing the engineering analysis was so high that was prohibitive as well. So until there is some sort of policy incentive for them to do that kind of analysis, they're not going to make the investment to even fully check if it really is viable or not. So I think that's an important point, that without the policy driver there, you really don't get these answers. And then in terms of other facilities that may be examples, there are case studies out there. They are primarily more coal than natural gas. There's been less robust data collection on potential for natural gas that we've found. And also, they don't tend to tell you the economics of it. They'll tell you something about what percentage of carbon they were able to capture, or how long it operated, whatever, but they don't tend to tell you all the details of here's their operating price, et cetera, because this is often proprietary information. So we continue to run into that barrier of companies generally don't want to share their internal financials with you.
Yeah. I'm just trying to figure out a way to get around that, to dance around that.
Yeah.
But also I was thinking about the CPRG, the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant program on the federal side. They're doing just that, to contribute the funds necessary to do the operational planning design work. And it's not analogous. It's not exactly apples to apples, but the U.S. Steel, I believe one of the CPRG grants was for putting carbon capture on a U.S. Steel facility in Clairton, Pennsylvania. And because that's the CPRG grant, my guess, I could be wrong, but my guess is the economics have to be public. I could be wrong.
Yeah, and this is part of what our recommendations are getting at as well, that to really find the answers to these things, you need to be in direct engagement with both the facilities and the communities in the area so that you know the details of their situation. And, we tried to do that to the extent we could with these case studies, but we weren't able to do a full analysis of, just one facility kind of thing, because that is its own complete study. So I definitely think there's a lot of potential for future work and follow-up studies that would look into those more detailed instances and would be very, very valuable for sure.
Other questions from the working group? I did just have one more, if I may.
Sure.
I didn't see page numbers on some of the slides, but there was a slide on summary of Maryland generator slide.
This one?
Yes. So, is there a de minimis level at which the facilities would not be included, say 20 megawatts or 10 megawatts?
I think for this, yes, there is, I want to say it's 1 megawatt here. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I just want to make sure we're actually noting that, or that
Yep.
there may be some facilities that fall below that. I'm thinking of cogen, for example. And then when you do solar, yeah, so why you have 144 is that's
Those are the ones that are over that
Right.
limit. Yes.
Okay.
But that's where I did note, we're also including, so the number of facilities is just the number that passed that threshold, but the generation here that we're showing does include distributed generation with the smaller facilities and rooftop, et cetera.
Okay,
So
that's
we do
really
bring
good
that
to
in
know.
from a different, yeah.
All right. And that's very clear. I don't see an asterisk or something, but that's very clear.
Yeah, so we do have a little asterisk here, but I didn't write it out on the slide, but it is written out in the report.
Okay, perfect. Other questions?
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone.
Again, this is Andrew Place. I'd note that the delivery, the final deliverable is on Thursday, I believe.
Friday.
Friday.
Yes.
Thank you. November 15th. All right, well done. Thank you. So there's a talk in the room here in case you can't hear it on the online. Okay, the sidebar. All right, thank you. And all right, so I wanted to open the floor for working group members for other business, things you want to bring before us today.
Just a
Sorry?
quick thing for the room. Jared, could you turn your sound on? Because my laptop is about to die and I don't want the sound to cut off. Yep. Okay, great.
So any comments, any statements anybody from the working group wants to make? I will note two things. One, that our next meeting is December 10th, virtual, as well as I'd like us to devote that time to framing up what our work will be for the coming year. Now that we're putting behind us the study, we've put behind us the recommendations that went before the Climate Commission. I think this is the time to plan out our work ahead of us for the coming year. And on the note about the Climate Commission, our recommendations are before them and have yet to be voted on. I believe we should have them on their November 19th agenda. And I will keep the working group informed of the state of those, whether they pass, whether they table, whether they fail, whether they're amended, and et cetera. Word for public, sorry, Jared. Oh, no. Sorry. All right, moving forward, public comment. We devote some time in each one of these meetings for public comment. If there are members of the public online here who would like to comment, please raise your hand and I'll recognize you. Seeing none, thank you very much. Again, I'll reiterate that our next meeting, public meeting is December 10th. And thank you all for participating today and the ongoing work we will for the sake of this working group. Thank you, and meeting is adjourned.